What up, Wizards? It's Dev, putting the G in SB Mtg. We like it in Magic, and today, pretty hyped day. You can officially play Magic on your phone, no matter what kind of phone you have. Wizards decided that they're just going to put, like, basically a masterpiece in every pack. That's pretty good news. And we got a whole bunch of Strixhaven spoilers today, too, so kind of a good time to be a Magic player. I don't get to say that enough, but we got to see card after card from Strixhaven today. Just a buttload of new spoilers, new mechanics on top of that too to learn lessons from. You know what I'm trying to, you know what pun I'm doing here. You've already seen the spoilers. But anyway, we've got a lot to talk about, so I guess we should go ahead and get into it. Now, for our first lesson, I guess we'll learn about a couple of these new mechanics. There you go. Nailed the pun that time. But as far as the learn mechanic, we got to see Professor of Symbology, Pop Quiz, and First Day of Class. Now, I think the Professor of Symbology is probably the most powerful looking of all of these. It's just 1 and a white for a 2/1 core cleric. And when it enters the battlefield, you'll learn. This has reminder text on it. You may reveal a lesson card you own from outside the game and put it into your hand, or discard a card to draw a card. So, in some ways, this is just a white creature for 2 mana that draws a card, so long as that card is a lesson and is lurking in your sideboard somewhere. In Limited, you have access to your entire sideboard, which is effectively every card you didn't draft. That's pretty good. What I will say, before I go any further and extrapolate upon what lessons actually are, first of all, Wizards has already officially announced that in Commander, you don't get a wish board. The learn ability just lets you rummage. Discard a card and then draw a card. You can't actually use the part of the ability that lets you get a lesson from your sideboard if you're playing on the Commander table. But every other format, from what I understand, you can play a wish board, and that makes Best of One a whole lot more interesting if we have an entire mechanic based around effectively creating wish boards. This creature's creature types are also worth noting, at least the cleric creature type, because there's actually a cleric deck that's kind of coming together in Standard, and this isn't the only card that we'll see for it today. I like the ability to, again, effectively draw a card on your white 2-drop. Not too bad, so I'm really kind of looking at this card pretty hard, but Pop Quiz isn't too bad either. It's 3 mana, 2 and a blue for an instant to draw a card, and you learn. I really like that this is instant speed, and it effectively draws 2 cards at instant speed, which is also, like, let's be honest, fairly powerful looking. And then we also got to see First Day of Class. They often say that I'm like school in summertime and that I have no class, but this card, actually pretty classy. 1 and a red for an instant. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and it gains haste until end of turn, and you just randomly get to learn. For 2 mana and instant speed, you effectively get to draw a card from your sideboard, which was already not too bad, but honestly, I really like the actual text box on this card. It just says creature, not non-token creature. It doesn't say, you know, you have to cast the creature, or it has to interplay from your hand, or anything like that. There's just any creature that comes into play from here on out the rest of this turn gets a little boost and some haste. And the haste part of this is actually what I'm most attracted to. I've already tried to use Doomscar Titan to do a whole bunch of really weird stuff. And I will say Doomscar Titan is on a body, so it's easy to like reanimate and abuse him that way, whereas you can't do that with this card. It's going to sit in your hand a lot of the game, and I don't necessarily love that, but this might be actually kind of decent in like Vadrock Mutate decks and whatnot. Either way, I like the ability to have yet another card in Standard that allows you to play a deck where you make a bunch of tokens or reanimate a bunch of creatures and you give them all haste for just a couple of mana. And on top of that, again, you get an extra card. You get to replace the card in your hand. So, or rummage if you'd rather do that if you're looking for something specific that's not in your wish board. So I just really like this ability an awful lot. But now let's look at what lessons we can actually learn when we go get cards from our sideboard. Let's look at Expanded Anatomy, Introduction to Prophecy, and Pest Summoning first. These are some of the lower level lessons that you could learn, but especially in Limited, it's going to be nice to have access to these cards in your sideboard. Expanded Anatomy is 3 mana for a sorcery. It's a lesson. Put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. It gains Vigilance until end of turn. So obviously not incredibly impressive, but it is colorless, and a couple of these are colorless, and that's actually going to matter a great deal, I think. Moving up in playability a little bit, though, is Introduction to Prophecy. This is a 3-mana sorcery that scries 2 and draws a card, so not super impressive at 3 mana, but it is pretty cool that any deck can do this. So maybe a deck that plays that 2-drop that learns a lesson when it comes into play, right? That can go get this, and then your like mono white deck has card draw later in the game. So not terrible, I guess. Some control decks that do have access to learn cards, especially if we see much better learn cards than we already have, might end up playing this just because, again, the card selection in the late game is going to be something you might want to have some access to, and especially in best of one, you're trying to fill out your sideboard. This could probably go in, but it's obviously, again, not incredible. I think we can all agree. Now, Pest Summoning isn't colorless, but it's still somewhat easy to cast because it has hybrid mana. It costs 1 and then 2 hybrid Golgari mana. That means you can pay either black or green for those colored mana symbols in its cost. It's a sorcery, it's a lesson. It has really cool art, and you can create 2 1/1 black and green pest creature tokens with, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. So for sacrifice fodder, or to just extend the game with blockers that gain you a little bit of life, maybe you have things in your deck that take advantage of gaining life, get +1/+1 counters, whatever, you know. It seems like it's at least like maybe worth the slot some of the time, and in limited especially, again, this is one that I really like because it's board presence in a box. It just sits in your sideboard, doesn't even have to take a slot in your 40 card main deck in limited. So I actually kind of like this card a good bit, but again, just for certain environments, and standard ain't one of them. From what I can see by this card. I mean, maybe there's going to be something that takes cool advantage of this, but from what I can tell right now, this is mostly meant for limited. It is, though, worth noting, I guess, that this is like bodies that a control deck could play out of their sideboard, that it doesn't have to like take up slots in the main deck, and I don't think that it's good enough for that purpose in standard, but it's at least worth remembering that it exists. But we'll move on to a couple of much better lessons, in my opinion, and that's Introduction to Annihilation and Confront the Past. Now, Introduction to Annihilation is a little bit expensive, we agree on that, but look at the text box. Sorcery, exile target non-land permanent its controller draws a card. Now, I don't want the opponent to draw a card, I don't want that at all, but I do like for any deck, regardless of color or color combination or whatever, to have the ability to go into their sideboard and grab something that exiles any permanent. Any permanent. It doesn't matter what it is, right? Especially, again, in best of one. For best of one, I think the learn ability looks really good. A little bit less in best of three because you won't have all these sideboard slots for subpar cards. But even in best of three, this looks like a card that you might want to go and get because the ability to exile any permanent, even for a cost like this, even at the cost of the opponent drawing a card, you cannot lose the game by playing this card, right? You can just stave your opponent off from winning, which is very often what you're going to be doing by removing a key permanent. But at least it's exile. At least it costs whatever mana you got floating around at the time. It doesn't matter what kind of deck you're playing. I think there's a lot of really cool things about this card, especially at the common rarity. This is going to be a cool limited card that you might end up playing in your main deck if you don't draft too many learn cards, because it's still kind of a perfectly playable thing one way or the other. But I really like the implications of this in Pauper with some of the common level learn cards that we either have seen or will see moving forward. So I think that this is a card that has multiple implications in multiple formats, from standard to limited to Pauper, and I'm just interested to see what the card actually ends up doing. But let's look at Confront the Past, which I think you could make an argument is a better card, even. This is X and a black for a sorcery. Choose one. Return target Planeswalker card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Just sub in converted mana cost if you haven't seen mana value yet. Or you can remove twice X loyalty counters from target Planeswalker on opponent controls. So, yeah, by the way, the art is pretty gut-wrenching if you're into the story, by the way. We're already nostalgic for War of the Spark, apparently. Let's never do War of the Spark again. Anyway, this just kills a Planeswalker. I mean, this is going to kill a Planeswalker anytime that you need it to. And you can wish for it, too, with the Learn ability. And that's kind of cool, because you might not want this taking up a slot in your main deck. You just might not want that. Even if you are playing Planeswalkers, it's kind of cool that, again, this doesn't take up a slot, because slots are precious, especially in best of one. So, you know, this, again, the learn ability effectively lets us play a sideboard in best of one, and I'm super jacked about that. I'm very excited about that. It just increases complexity and overall fun and options in the late game, and I'm very excited about that. But having Planeswalker removal, that also allows you to reanimate a Planeswalker if you have enough mana. I mean, 9 mana, you get your Ugin back. seems okay some of the time, right? I just like this card an awful lot, and of all of the lesson cards that we've seen so far, it's probably the most playable. Although exile target permanent is right on its heels. But there are other mechanics in this great game that we play. We also got to see Magecraft, which we saw the other day, and we'll get to that card in just a moment. But let's look at some of the lower level stuff with Magecraft that's mostly limited playable. But I do want to cover every card from today. So let's look at Eager First Year and Stormkiln Artist. Now, Eager First Year is just 2 mana, 1 and a white for a 2/2 human wizard with Magecraft. Whenever you cast a copy an instant or sorcery spell, Eager First Year gets +1/+0 until end of turn. So in limited, it's a 2/2 body for 2 mana, so it's already somewhat playable. Might have relevant creature types depending on what you're doing. And the ability to get to 3 or 4 power the next turn might actually be very important. The ability to do that at instant speed during your opponent's combat step might be very important. I actually think this is a really cool card, but obviously it's not going to do much outside of limited. But it's a pretty cool, like, bread and butter 2-drop in limited. Stormkiln Artist is 4 mana, 3 and a red for a 2/2 dwarf shaman, and it gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control. See, the cool part about that is that it has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, create a treasure token. So every time you cast or copy an instant or sorcery, he gets a little bit bigger. But what I really like about this card is that if you cast like a 1 mana instant or sorcery, like an opt, you draw a card, you create a treasure token, that opt was effectively free. Then you use the treasure token to cast like a crash through and draw a card and create a treasure token. So I really like the implications of this with very low cost spells, especially those that draw cards, because this will, you know, either let you keep, you know, just spamming spells for that entire turn, or just give you a bunch of mana to use on your next turn, which is also fairly good. So I think it's a cool card, but at the end of the day, I gotta say, even in decks in Standard that want it, like Magda Dwarves or whatever, I still don't think the card quite gets there. I think it's priced out of competitive play, but that text box is pretty tempting. Now let's get to the apprentice cycle of all the Magecraft dudes from all the different guilds. I don't think we're supposed to call them guilds. Houses, I guess, from this set. Starting kind of from my least favorite on up to my most favorite. And I guess that means we'll have to start with Silverquill Apprentice. A very thin person there. Not judging, just a very thin person on the art. And this, even though this is probably my least favorite of the Apprentice cycle, I'm not saying it's bad. This could actually do some pretty cool stuff. It's just a white and a black for a 2/2 human warlock. Good to see some warlock representation. It has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, target creature gets +1/+0 till end of turn. So not terrible. I mean, I was just saying about another card that it's a 2 mana 2/2. And whenever you Magecraft, it gets a little bit bigger, and that's really good at instant speed, especially for the combat step. So again, pretty decent and limited, but I don't think that it transcends in any other format. Even if you are playing a fairly aggro strategy, I'm just not sure it's worth setting up with this card. So I'll move on to Lorehold Apprentice. This has baffled a lot of people today. This is just a white and a red for a 2/2 human cleric with Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell until end of turn, spirit creatures you control gain tap. This creature deals 1 damage to each opponent. So what? Why is this? What a weird ability, right? And this is one of the few Magecraft abilities that it's not really worth proccing multiple times in the same turn, which I think is interesting. But, you know, maybe they're reprinting Spectral Procession or something. Who knows in this set? But I do think it's kind of cool that this does signal some sort of spirit tribal down the road, and they've already done some things to set that up a little bit in Standard. There's not a whole lot of spirits, but there are some. So I think this is kind of cool, and I'm hoping that it just, you know, leads us to this janky deck that tries to get a bunch of spirits out, plays instants and sorceries, and then just taps the spirits for damage. I mean, it all seems cool to me, but I don't know how viable it actually is. I just want to jank. We all want to jank, so, you know, come on. But let's move on to Prismario Apprentice. This is 2 mana, Izzet colors for a 2/2 human shaman, and it has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy blah blah blah, Prismario Apprentice can't be blocked this turn. If that spell has mana value 5 or greater, put a +1/+1 counter on Apprentice. Now, this is not great, but again, I really like this in limited. I love unblockable creatures, so I'm rating this a little bit higher than I should, right? But honestly, if your opponent can't deal with this, it's not too hard to keep casting instants and sorceries, even in limited, especially in this set, which I imagine is going to be loaded with good instants and sorcery, right? So, you know, it shouldn't be hard to get this up to a 4/4 or 5/5 if your opponent can't immediately remove it. And at that point, it goes unblockable and just like ends games. I'm pretty sure this is really, really good in limited. And I want to try it in Standard, but I don't think it works so much there. But in Limited, I imagine this is kind of one of those must-answer cards if your opponent can keep fueling it. But we'll move on to Quandrix Apprentice. A lot of people are calling this the best one, and it just might be. This is a green and a blue for a 2/2 human wizard with Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy a blah blah, look at the top 3 cards of your library. You may reveal a land card from among them and put that card into your hand. Put the rest in the bottom of your library in any order. So kind of a, what is that, a Nessian Wanderer in a way? Whatever the Theros thing is that gives you lands. It's like pretty much the exact same ability. But this one, really easy to proc too. You can proc multiple times in the same turn if you're looking for, you know, specific lands, or if you're just looking to increase your land count. This is good in those decks. It's decent for the mana cost, right? You get an okay body for the mana cost at the very least. And I'm not sure that this is going to be worth being your 2-drop in Standard at the end of the day, but this does look like one of the more attractive options in that it effectively draws a card most of the time whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, and that's good. Never miss a land drop again, right? So like an opt effectively draws 2 cards for 1 mana at this rate. That seems actually much better than you might rate it at first. So I think Quandrix Apprentice actually has a chance to end up in Standard, depending on what the rest of the Simic 2-drops look like. But moving on to my favorite of the cycle. I didn't say it was the best, it's just my favorite of the cycle. We get Witherbloom Apprentice. This is a black and a green for a 2/2 human druid, and it has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or do the thing, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So that's my kind of steez right there, dude. I can't wait to get multiples of these out, right? Especially considering I want to play like Jund Burn of some kind with 4 copies of this, and when you cast the shock, then suddenly if you have 2 copies of this, the shock does 4 damage. I know that it's magical Christmas land. It'll never happen. It's a noob dream, but I want it pretty bad. I want it pretty bad. Or like Fruit of Tizerius, just the 1 black thing. It costs, I think it's a sorcery. It costs 1 black. Opponent loses 2 life. It has escape. Like, that seems kind of interesting with this card. You don't even have to add a 3rd color to your deck. It's just, I kind of like this way more than I should, because I really like effects like this that just rack up drains. You know, I'm a sucker for this, and I do think that rating this more highly than the Simic one does kind of make me look like a sucker, but I'll say it again, I am a sucker for drains, especially drains on like a young pyromancer ability, right? So many creatures in the set get to be a young pyromancer. I'm excited about this thing. But our next Magecraft cards are Archmage Emeritus and Dragon's Guard Elite. Emeritus is 4 mana, 2 and 2 blue for a 2/2 human wizard. Whenever you cast or do the thing, draw a card. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, draw a card is super good. That's amazing. I'm not sure that it's going to be worth the 4 mana in Standard that you have to pay for this. I think that Standard might not be super, you know, inviting to a card like this right now, like actively hostile, especially if it's only got 2 toughness. I don't know that I'd dare it, and I don't think it's going to show up. Well, I'd probably dare it in a stupid janky deck that I want to draw a bunch of cards in. But honestly, if I was looking to play like real tournament Magic and win every game, or most of my games, I don't think this is a card I'd really look to include. But in Commander, that's probably where this card is going to shine the brightest, baby. I'm really looking forward to playing this card there, where I think it might actually be like kind of a staple in some ways. The card just looks like a banger to me. But moving on to Dragon's Guard Elite. This is 2 mana, 1 and a green for a 2/2 human druid. And it has Magecraft. Whenever you do the thing, put a +1/+1 counter on Elite, and you can pay 4 and 2 green to double the number of counters on Elite. That seems pretty sexy, honestly. I saw Saffron Olive call this like the best Kyrion Dryad ever, and I do have like some this Kyrion Dryad. You can cast like creatures and stuff and still put counters on it, but I still think this is really, really good, right? You can even cast a green spell and put counters on it, but you can't say about Kyrion Dryad. So there you go. Plus, you can just like, you don't even double its power until end of turn or anything. You literally double the number of +1/+1 counters on it. You can threaten to do that at instant speed, like during your opponent's combat step. You can hold up your mana and do it at the end of their turn, and suddenly you've got like a 12/12. Actually doesn't seem like a bad card for an investment of just 2 mana on the front half, you know, on the front end at least. That seems actually good, but at the end of the day, I have to say this about every card. I'm not actually sure that this is playable either. It's just really, really attractive. But while we're talking about Magecraft, I might as well talk about Professor Liliana. It's actually Professor Angelina Jolie. Actually, Professor Onyx. Nailed it that time. 6 mana, 4 and 2 black for a legendary Liliana Planeswalker. See, she's a Liliana. She has Magecraft as well. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, Tendrils of Agony. Each opponent loses 2 life, you gain 2 life. You can +1 Lily, Onyx, I suppose. Lose 1 life. Look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, rest into your graveyard. -3 Lilia over here. Each opponent sacrifices a creature with the greatest power among creatures that player controls. And if you -8 Onyx, each opponent may discard a card. If they don't, they lose 3 life. Repeat this process 6 more times. So that's kind of cute. +1 is a strategic planning or anticipate. Pick whichever one you like more. -3 is effectively Soul Shatter without the Planeswalker clause. And then -8 is kind of Mind Twist. It's basically Mind Twist, but if they don't have a handful of cards, it really just does a whole lot of life loss to them. Just all of the life loss in the world, right? Like, you can literally win the game. With this, I mean, you can deal 21 damage with this if your opponent doesn't have any cards in their hand. So that seems like a kind of an interesting win condition for discard decks, perhaps, right? And it also kind of has a Megrim effect if you really want to look at it sideways like that. If you're looking at this in a discard deck, every time you cast a discard spell, your opponent loses 2 life, you gain 2 life. So it's like kind of like Megrim, kind of. That's how I'm looking at it, at least. But anyway, card's cool. It costs 6 mana though, and I'm not sure that 6 mana for a card that you almost certainly have to untap with to win the game. I mean, you probably do win if you untap with this card and a bunch of instants and sorceries in your hand, but you do have to wait a turn most of the time. And it does meaningfully protect itself from the biggest creature on your opponent's side of the table, but it's going to cost most of its loyalty. If you +1 it, it does go up to 6, but all you really get out of that is an anticipate that costs you life, and I'm not sure you want that for 6 mana. So I do have issues with this card, but it does seem fairly balanced, and it'll probably show up in a deck or two along the way somewhere. I think it's worth noting you can get this back with a Blood on the Snow if you pay the full 6 snow. So that might show up somewhere. I mean, I'm not counting the card out of playability right now because I really, really like the Magecraft ability. But we're not even like close to done with the hype at all. We got a bunch of MDFC creatures today, and some of them look really good. Some of them don't look good, but maybe I'm wrong. Could be I'm wrong about cards like Cayenne. Maybe Cayenne is a little spicier than I think. Hey, there's a good pun for you. Cayenne, Dean of Substance. Hopefully she's as spicy as this top she's wearing. I like that. This is 3 mana, 2 and a green for a 2/2 legendary elf druid. Nice creature type there. You can tap it to exile the top card of your library. If it's a land card, put it into your hand. Otherwise, put a study counter on it. You can pay 4 and a green to create a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token. Put a +1/+1 counter on it for each different mana value among non-land cards you own in exile with study counters on them. So that is to say, for each card, that's a lot of words. For each card that you exile with a study counter on it, for each card that isn't a land when you tap this card for its first ability, you get to create a creature of that PT, right? Like the first time that you exile a card with a study counter on it, you can create a 1/1 for 5 mana, then a 2/2 after you exile another card. After you exile another card, a 3/3, right? Or you can just create a bunch of 1/1s after you exile one card, if you want to do that. But that does cost a lot of mana, and this is a pretty big time and mana investment, so I don't love it. But I do love a card that kind of says tap to draw a card. I kind of like that, but I still am not sure that I love the front half of this card. But let's look at the other half. Ibrahim, Dean of Theory, an owl person. It's 4 mana, 2 and 2 blue for a 3/3 legendary bird wizard with flying. And you can pay X 2 blue and tap it to exile the top X cards of your library and put a study counter on each of them. Then you may put a card you own in exile with a study counter on it into your hand. This is way better than the front half of the card. It also works well with the front half of the card, obviously. If you have the bird wizard out and you put a whole bunch of cards into exile, well, suddenly the first half of it, Cayenne, can make like huge fractals, huge living math. Is that living math? Is that what that's supposed to be? Anyway, it can make huge creature tokens. So I like the way the two cards work with each other. I like that they're kind of continuing that trend on these MDFC cards. But in any case, Ibrahim looks like way super cool. It's a great like mana sink, and even though you only get one card per turn out of it, that still seems pretty sweet to me, honestly. And I'm not sure how standard playable the card actually is, because I don't love the stat line. I don't love the mana cost either. You'd be doing a lot of really cool stuff in standard for 4 mana, but if you even get to tap this once and get a card out of it, it's probably good. I mean, my issue with that is that you paid 4 mana for it, you wait a turn. To use its ability, you probably tap all of your mana, and you don't even get to cast the card that turn. So that's a little disappointing, but, you know, on the commander table, this looks really good, and if you can set up maybe a late game situation where this gets you card advantage every turn, it actually looks pretty good. But let's move on to Valentin, Dean of the Vein. Is that Valentin, Dean of the Vein? I want to make all those words rhyme somehow. As well as Lisette, Dean of the Root. Now, Valentin is just 1 black mana for a 1/1 legendary vampire warlock, and good creature types there, especially knowing that we have a vampire set from Innistrad coming up in the fall. I want as many vampire creature types as we can get in these sets moving up to it. But anyway, it's 1 mana for a 1/1 Menace lifelink. Cool abilities. And if a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. Now I just want to point out, I want to stop right here and say that if that was all of the text on the card, I would kind of like the card. But when you do, you may pay 2 mana. If you do, create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. So apparently it's canon now that pests gain your life when they die. But this is actually really, really cool. I like that this just keeps your opponent off of graveyard shenanigans as long as it's on the table, right? That seems really, really cool. I mean, they can discard or mill cards into the library and reanimate them, but you know, if a creature dies, it's gone as long as this thing's on the table, and that's actually pretty sweet to come with your 1 mana 1/1 with 2 keyword abilities. Like, I just kind of like that in general, but the ability to dump extra mana into it. I like when 1-drops are also mana sinks, so they do something later in the game. This fills your board, actually gives you, you know, some sort of benefit for killing your opponent's creatures. You know, you can effectively 2-for-1 your opponent if you play a removal spell, and I think that's all like really good on just a 1-drop. So I like this card already, but let's look at Lisette, Dean of the Root. This is 4 mana, 2 green for a 4/4 legendary human druid. Whenever you gain life, you may pay 1. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Those creatures gain trample till end of turn. So you see how it works. You kill a bunch of your opponent's creatures, you pay mana, you get pests of your own, and then after you like, if a pest dies, you can pay 1 life if you have a Lisette out, and then put a +1/+1 counter on all your pests and all your other creatures. Give them trample. I like how these two work together too. And the stat line on Lisette is okay. I mean, 4 mana 4/4s aren't what they used to be, but at least they're somewhat worth the time. At least it's not like a 4 mana 3/4 or 2/4, something like that. I would not like that at all. At least the stat line is somewhat respectable. And honestly, I kind of like this ability even void of the front half of the card. If you never draw the front half of the card, there are plenty of ways to gain life. Like, we might actually see like Abzan or Selesnya life gain now, right? Because think of all the white cards that give you some kind of benefit when you gain life. Speaker of the Heavens and on and on and on, right? There are a million of them at this point. And this seems really, really good with all those. Put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control whenever you gain life. How good is that with lifelink creatures? Like, I mean, obviously there's a lifelink creature on the front half of this, so that's one way that this works. But just with any lifelink creature, or a board full of them especially, this is freaking unbelievable. So I actually really like both halves of this card, and I'm not even sure that it's destined to see a whole lot of standard play, but with the rate on both of them, I think that it's pushed even for standard playability. But up next, let's take a look at Shale? Maybe it's Shale, Dean of Radiance, and Ambrose, Dean of Shadow. That's right, Dean Ambrose. Wrestling fans, this is, anyway, Dean of Radiance, the owl man here. It's 2 mana. That's really cool art, by the way. It's 1 and a white for a 1/1 legendary bird cleric with flying and vigilance. And you can tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that entered the battlefield under your control this turn. That's actually kind of really cool, especially if you have like Reverent Hoplite or anything else that lets you put a bunch of creatures out at one time. You know, even Omen of the Sun or something suddenly gets you 4 power if you're able to tap this guy, right? And in the meantime, he's got flying and vigilance. He can attack and then tap while he's attacking. Like, all this actually seems kind of good for just 2 mana with a very relevant creature type in Cleric. This is yet another new 2-drop for the Cleric's deck, so keep that in mind. But Ambrose, Dean of Shadow, looking like Norman Reedus. Is that just me? Isn't that the guy's name from Walking Dead? Anyway, this is 4 mana, 2 and 2 black for a 4/4 legendary human warlock. I'm a little bummed that this half isn't a cleric, but whatever. You can tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on another target creature. Then Ambrose, Dean of Shadow, deals 2 damage to that creature. Whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, draw a card. Now, I'm not as impressed by this half, and I'm not even saying the front half is that impressive. I just like a little bit more than this. You do get a 4 mana 4/4 again. Not a super impressive stat line, but also nothing to sneeze at. It's not terrible. So there's that. The ability to tap it and either kill a small creature, literally a 1 toughness creature your opponent controls, or, you know, maybe put a counter on a 2/2 that you control, or something like that, right? You put a counter on it, then it takes 2, so it still has 1 toughness for the remainder of the turn. So, you know, that doesn't seem too bad whatsoever, especially in combination with a bunch of clerics that can get +1/+1 counters regardless of whether or not this card is tapped. You know, like Luminarch Aspirant, Cleric puts counters on things. Cleric of Life's Bond, 2-drop Cleric, gets counters. Taborax, 3-drop Cleric, gets counters. So this actually works kind of well with a lot of the stuff that's already in the Cleric's deck, even despite the fact that it's not a Cleric. So I kind of like a lot about that, right? You get like another Taborax in your deck, like something that whenever your dudes die, you draw a card. And that's like super valuable for an aggro deck that's looking to get a little bit into the mid-range, like Cleric's is. But let's take a look at Uvilda, Dean of Perfection, who has got the drip. Like, look at the steez on Uvilda, dude. It's 3 mana, 2 and a blue for a 2/2 legendary Djinn wizard. And you can tap it to exile an instant or sorcery card from your hand and put 3 home counters on it. It gains, at the beginning of your upkeep, if this card is exiled, remove a home counter from it, and when the last home counter is removed from this card, if it's exiled, you may cast it. It costs 4 less to cast this way, so it's not quite Suspend, although it works exactly like Suspend. It just doesn't let you play the card for free. It lets you play it for 4 less, which is like pretty unbelievable, dude. Like that's pretty crazy. It might not be as good as it looks at first glance because you have to cast the card immediately when the home counter is exiled. I wish you could kind of hold the card and just cast it whenever you wanted to, but that might be asking a little bit too much, you know. Being able to cast like an Alrund's Epiphany for just a few mana, like, seems pretty great to me. So I'm kind of a fan of the front half of this card, even if it never pops off. You know, it's a 3 mana 2/2 with no keyword ability, so it's kind of bad looking, all things considered. But I will say, if you get to tap it even once, it allows you to do some pretty gross things, provided you can make it to the point in the game where you actually cast the spell. But, you know, I guess you could say that at the point in the game where you could actually cast the spell, you probably could have just actually cast the spell if you hadn't have suspended it, right? It also doesn't work with like ultimatums, because who cares if you reduce their cost by 4 generic, you still have to pay 7 for them. So this doesn't work with certain extremely powerful cards in the format, but it does work with others, and I'm interested in it. But I'm not a huge fan of a creature, all things considered. I'm not a huge fan of a creature that costs 3 mana for a 2/2 Scathe Zombies. Then you have to wait until the next turn, and then you have to tap it so it can't participate in combat. And then you have to wait 3 turns to actually get any juice out of it. So it's probably bad, but I'm very interested in it. I think that Nasari, Dean of Expression, the other side of this card, is a little bit better. This is 5 mana, 3 and 2 red for a 4/4 legendary Ifrit Shaman. And at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of each opponent's library. Until end of turn, you may cast spells from among those exiled cards, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast those spells. Whenever you cast a spell from exile, put a +1/+1 counter on Nasari. That's just dope. All of this is grass. Like, this seems really good to me. You know, you effectively get a free card off the top of your opponent's library every turn, and you can cast it with your own mana. Not a big deal. Oh, and if that weren't enough, this also gets counters whenever you cast a card from exile. Not just a card that you exiled with it, but just any card that you happen to cast from exile, which, you know, adventure creatures and whatnot, you put +1/+1 counters on this. Seems kind of cool. I just think that I like this card a lot more, even though the first card, the first half of it, is more bonkers and has some pretty cool implications, especially for Jank Lords. But this is just free extra card advantage every turn on a creature that gets bigger. That's just a straight up and down decent looking Magic card, even at that rate. At the rate it's at, I'm not sure it participates in Standard anytime soon, but I at least want to toy around with it, because a free card every turn is good. From what I'm told, seems good. But we got a couple of these MDFCs left to cover, so let's get to them. We got to talk about Torrance Sculptor, which actually gives us a look at a new ability too, or at least a keyworded ability that kind of already existed. This is 4 mana, 2 and 2 blue for a 2/2 Merfolk Wizard with Ward 2. Whenever this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, counter it unless that player pays 2. So this, again, is an ability we've seen on a few cards before, but they finally keyworded it, and I actually really like this ability. Whenever Torrance Sculptor enters the battlefield, exile an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard. Put a number of +1/+1 counters on Torrance Sculptor equal to half that card's mana value, round it up. So let's get back to Alrund's Epiphany, you know? You put a bunch of counters on this card if you exile an Alrund's Epiphany, if it somehow made it into your graveyard, right? You have to exile it when you cast it, but if it somehow made it into your graveyard, there you go. And there's a bunch of other cards, right? I mean, there will probably be some instant or sorcery in this set somewhere that costs like effectively 10 or 12 to cast, but you can reduce its cost somehow. And a card like that seems really good if you can dump it into your graveyard and then make your Torrance Sculptor huge, right? But All things considered, even with the ward ability, this isn't the card that I'm like excited about. The card that I'm more excited about is the second half, which is Flamethrower Sonata, which is maybe the best name for a Magic card. Like, possibly ever, but at least in the last few sets. Flamethrower Sonata? Are we letting Castlevania people name cards now? Like, I love it. Anyway, Flamethrower Sonata, I'm never going to get tired of saying that. It's 2 mana, 1 and a red for a sorcery. Discard a card, then draw a card. When you discard an instant or sorcery card this way, Sonata deals damage equal to that card's mana value to target creature or planeswalker you don't control. So, I don't like the you don't control clause on this, honestly, because I want to play with Brash Taunter, but everything else considered, I actually really like this, possibly above cards, like Tormenting Voice, even Cathartic Reunion, but maybe not Cathartic Reunion. I will say, comparing this to Tormenting Voice, you still kind of get the same card parity, right? Tormenting Voice, discard a card, and spend Tormenting Voice to draw 2 cards, so it's card parity. This, you still get card parity if your opponent has a permanent on the battlefield, or a creature, a planeswalker, or whatever, so you still draw a card off of it, you spend this, you discard a card, then you draw a card, and you kill one of your opponent's creatures. So it's still card parity, but it actually affected the board state, which you can't say about a card like Tormenting Voice. And I love a card like this that allows you to bin an important card for reanimation later, or escaping later, or whatever. All the cool things you do with Tormenting Voice when you discard those cards. And draw deeper into your deck to help find key, combo pieces, or the sweeper, or whatever, while also affecting the board state. I actually think this is a very powerful looking card in a lot of ways, and I see people underrating it today. I wouldn't do that, right? If your opponent doesn't have any creatures to remove with it, or you don't need to dig deeper or discard a card or anything like that, it's a body. And that's pretty good too. So the card is just never dead against any deck, right? It always does something. And when you do use it as a removal spell that effectively draws you a card and bends an important card, it's just going to feel really good. I like everything this card does. I actually think it's really, really good. But there's only one of these MDFC creatures left to talk about today. We got Plarg. It's got 2 Gs. Plarg, Dean of Chaos. And Augusta, Dean of Order. How are these the same person? Plarg is 2 mana, 1 and a red for a 2/2 legendary Orc Shaman. You can tap it to discard a card and draw a card. Actually, I should say that correctly. It's tap and discard a card to draw a card. Discard a card is part of the activation, which will matter. But in any case, you can also pay 4 and a red and tap it to reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-legendary, non-land card with mana value 3 or less. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Put all revealed cards not cast this way on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this can cast creatures. First of all, this can cast bodies and enchantments that only cost 3 mana or less. And I think that's actually really important to note, but it mostly, I think this is important as well, cast removal spells. It casts removal spells and card draw spells for not free or anything, but it's kind of cool that you can do this, at instant speed on your opponent's turn, EOT, something like that, during combat, and that's all going to be like really important applications of the card. Your opponent might not want to swing in on you because you might have a creature in those top few that you can put on the battlefield and do disgusting things with. If you actually get this card off of its own ability, just play Augusta off of it for free. That seems cool too. And if you are able to do that, you can blow out your opponent during combat because of what Augusta does. Augusta is 3 mana, 2 and a white for a 1/3 legendary human cleric. Nice creature type there, lady. And other tapped creatures you control get +1/+0. Other untapped creatures you control get +0/+1. Whenever you attack, untap each creature you control, then tap any number of creatures you control. So cool stuff about that. First of all, in paper, that's going to be weird math for your opponent to do. On Arena, it'll do the math for your opponent and for you, thankfully. But what this also does is allows vigilant creatures to tap if you want them to when they attack. If you want an extra boost out of them, that might lead to you just outright winning the game, doing a little bit more damage, whatever. So that's good. But again, I want to live the dream where my opponent swings in on me, I tap Plarg for its ability, I play Augusta for free, and then suddenly all my creatures have +0/+1, and that just wrecks combat for my opponent. It's a thing that could happen. I really like both halves of this card, and even though I'm not sure how good Augusta actually is in a lot of situations, I hope that it's good, right? I mean, it's an Anthem effect. That seems like it would be pretty good, especially in the Cleric's deck. But, if we want to make the Cleric's deck splash red or something so we can cast the Plarg half of it, this is going to cast most of the cards, sans, Aura. in the Cleric's deck, and that seems pretty good too. So the Cleric's deck needs a mana sink. There's all kinds of cool stuff about this card on both sides, and I'm really interested to lab with it because I think it might be one of the cooler MDFCs we've seen all day without us actually knowing it. What I'm most excited about is Plarg's tap ability, despite the fact that it costs about 1 billion mana. It might as well, at least, but I'm still really excited to, like, just, you know, ambush somebody in combat or EOT with, like, an enter the battlefield trigger on a 2-drop or something. There's just a lot of really cool stuff you can do with Plarg, and I'm interested to play this card. Now, what I should have said was there was only one more MDFC creature to look at, because there's actually one more MDFC card all totaled, and that is the MDFC Planeswalker. Rowan and Will, ladies and gentlemen. Rowan, Scholar of Sparks, is the bad one. It's 3 mana, 2 and a red for a 2 loyalty Planeswalker. That's all you get. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Both Will and Rowan have this static ability. You can +1 Rowan to have Rowan deal 1 damage to each opponent. If you've drawn 3 or more cards this turn, she deals 3 damage to each opponent instead. You can -4 Rowan to have an emblem with whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you may pay 2. If you do, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. Really important to remember in a set with Magecraft. Keep that in mind. Now, Will, Scholar of Frost is 5 mana, a little bit more, 4 and a red for a 4 loyalty Planeswalker, with, again, the same passive ability as Rowan. You can +1 Will and have up to 1 target creature have base power and toughness 0-2 till your next turn. And you can -3 Rowan to draw 2 cards. You can also -7 Rowan. The ultimate is exile up to 5 target permanents. For each permanent exile this way, its controller creates a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature token. That's probably the best thing you can do with Rowan, is turn it into a 4/4. Yuck, yuck, waka, waka. But I honestly do think if you can get the ultimate on Rowan, it's unbelievably good for the entire rest of the game, but it might be a little bit harder. She doesn't protect herself very well. She only starts at 2, really 3 loyalty most of the time, and that's just not great, even for a 3 loyalty Planeswalker. If you play it into attacking creatures at all, you effectively skipped your turn 3 to probably gain a few life, effectively, because your opponent's not swinging at you, they're swinging at Rowan, and deal 1 damage to your opponent. So I'm not sure how great that's going to be in some situations, but if you can reliably ultimate this, then obviously it's, like, freaking stupid. It's unbelievable. You got a Vorinclex out, play a Rowan, ultimate it, you're good for the rest of the game. But as far as Will goes, this looks a little bit better. This does plus to protect itself. It goes up to 5 loyalty to protect itself from a creature for a turn cycle, and that's what I like to see out of a Planeswalker. I also like to see real card advantage, not just replacing itself, but, you know, draw 2 cards with its minus ability. That seems really good too, and I'm not sure about the ultimate on this, but I'm not sure how often you actually want to play the ultimate. This looks like a thing where you +1, +1, -3, +1, you know, you just alternate between those abilities. I do like the idea of a MDFC Planeswalker, because if Rowan isn't particularly good at the moment, you don't play it. Just wait on Will. It's a much better Planeswalker. For some reason. I'm not sure why, storyline-wise, but in any case, that said, if it's the beginning of the game, you're playing against a control deck or something like that doesn't have a whole lot of board presence, go ahead and play your Rowan. You might actually get to ultimate it, and you'll do a few damage to your opponent while you're at it. And if you ultimate it, you kind of get a lot of card advantage off of that before everything's said and done. And imagine what you can copy in this format right now. So, like, much easier to ultimate, but bad until you get there. Rowan, much better, but if you don't have, like, 1 billion lands to start the game in your opening hand, but you do have a Rowan, maybe think about going ahead and playing it. There's a lot of different ins and outs to when you'll play which side of each of these cards. You know, is it safe to try to build to an ultimate? Well, I'll go ahead and play Rowan because I have control of the game. So, you know, there are lots of different situational reasons to play one or the other, but ultimately, I gotta say it, it's kind of a catchphrase, this video. I don't know how much standard play it sees. You know, I really think the passive ability is probably the best thing about this card. And if either one of these, I mean, they're both the same card, but, you know, if this ends up seeing play, I think it'll be in large part due to that passive ability. So I do like that about it, but I'm still not like 100% sold on it. Well, let me move on to the last new card of the day so far, and it's pretty hype. It's mythic, it's an Elder Dragon, it's Quandrix Silverquill, and I can't tell if this name is going to be cringe to some people, but honestly, I kind of like it. Quandrix Silverquill. It's 5 mana, 3, a white and a black. I love me an Orzhov Elder Dragon, kids. I gotta tell you, it's a 2/5 flying double strike. At the beginning of each combat on your turn, I don't know why I put each in there. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may choose 2. each mode must target a different player. So note the word may in there. You don't have to choose any abilities. But if you don't choose any abilities, you don't get any. If you do choose to do abilities, you get exactly 2. Not 1, not 3, but 2 of these abilities. Target player creates a 2/1 white and black inkling creature token with flying. Or target player draws a card and loses 1 life. Or target player puts a +1/+1 counter on each creature they control. Now again, each mode has to target a different player. So if you choose to do one of these because you want to do it, you have to give a decent mode to your opponent. I imagine a lot of the time, you're probably going to make them draw a card and lose a life if you're just trying to do as much damage to them as possible. The other modes aren't great, right? If you give them a creature, they can block Quandrix, which isn't super great. But I guess sometimes, if you have a board full of dudes, you'll give them a 2/1 and put a counter on each creature you control. And at that point, you'll probably do more damage that way, depending on how many creatures you have. Plus, you're putting counters on Quandrix, right? So you put counters on a double strike, that gets out of hand after just a couple of turns. So I really like how fair this card is. Let me put it that way. Rather than saying I don't think the card's going to make it in standard, I'll say I think this card is extremely fair, which is not the mark of a competitively playable card, but it's still the mark of a really well-designed card, and a card that I could be kind of excited about playing in Commander in some ways, especially considering it's Orzhov. That's my favorite, color combination. My favorite 2-color combination, at least. And has been the whole time. For 26 years, I've loved Orzhov, way before it was called Orzhov. So I'm glad that it has an Elder Dragon. I'm glad that it's a cool design. It's a fair design, and there's probably some fun stuff you can do with it. But 5 mana is a lot. Let me just put it that way. I'll temper my expectations, and maybe yours, by saying that 5 mana is an awful lot. But let's finish off today by talking a little bit about the Mystical Archives, everybody, because this actually gets, slightly confusing, especially to newer players. First of all, cool thing about these is that they're kind of like masterpieces. They look like masterpieces, right? But they're actually more akin to time spiral time shifted cards, because you get one in every single pack, and it doesn't take the place of a card that would have otherwise been in the pack. It doesn't take the place of a rare or a foil or an uncommon or anything like that. This gets its own card slot, so you're effectively getting an extra card in every pack, which is already good enough, but getting the equivalent of a ridiculously dope art masterpiece in some cases in every pack will control the value of the cards, which I'm kind of into. They can reprint cards that are really necessary for Commander in the Mystical Archives, and hopefully drive the prices way down on some of these pieces, and people will get to play some really good looking cards, because all of these are extremely pretty. We got to see Harmonize, Ephemerate, Putrefy, Defiant Strike, Mind's Desire, Village Rites, and oh my god, y'all. Harmonize and Village Rites are absolutely gorgeous. Mind's Desire looks so cool, and by the way, something else I should point out is that I believe every card on screen at the moment will be playable, legal, in Historic. And yes, you will be opening, one of these cards in each pack on Arena as well, not just in real life. So that'll help build your Historic collection with some really sharp-looking cards. Now, they have already announced that 7 of the cards that appear in Mystical Archives will not be legal to play in Historic. Right now, the ones that we know of, if I'm not mistaken, are Demonic Tutor and Swords to Plowshares. And I think it's heavily speculated that Lightning Bolt is not going to be playable in Historic. But I don't think they've officially announced that. It's not on their website right now, at least at time of recording. So you're not going to be able to play with all of these, but they have confirmed that Mind's Desire is going to be Historic legal. So, I might have to dip my toe in a Historic for real this time, because, Mind's Desire and Historic is, I'm going nuts over that. So keep in mind that most of the cards, not all, but most of the cards in Mystical Archives are Historic legal, and that could definitely change the face of things. Another one that's in this set that people are heavily speculating, but again, I can't find it on their website, that it's banned in Historic, not as of publishing this video. But a lot of people are speculating Dark Ritual, not going to be legal. Again, if there's an official announcement, I haven't seen it, and I've looked very hard for it. But I imagine this card does get banned in Historic because it's Dark freaking Ritual, right? But we also saw Inquisition of Kozilek, Whirlwind Denial, Cultivate, Growth Spiral, Weather the Storm. All of these are just so gorgeous. Look at that Growth Spiral, dudes. Whoo, look at that Growth Spiral. It's so nice. We got to see Urza's Rage, Krosan Grip, Day of Judgment, Snakeskin Veil, Blue Sun Zenith, Sign in Blood. there's so many good, like, just commander playable cards in this grouping of cards. But notice how many standard playable cards there are too. Now note, this is another confusing thing. The only way that any of these cards are legal in standard is if they already exist in standard, right? So, like in the case of Snakeskin Veil, that's legal in standard already. You can play this version of the card in standard. But Blue Sun Zenith, that's not legal in standard. You can't play that in standard. You can't, but it is a commander staple in a lot of ways that I think is going to be really cool to have access to in a really good looking form. I mean, look how pretty that card is, crisp. Like even Sign in Blood looks really, really, really good, and that's kind of a commander staple, especially for more budget-minded commander players. And that Sign in Blood is beautiful. We also got to see Abundant Harvest. Shock is what that is, not choke, but shock. Which looks good. Counterspell, is that going to be historic legal? Is Counterspell historic legal now? It looks really good. Strategic Planning. Channel. Look how good Channel looks, y'all. Duress. This is the Duress I'll be playing for the rest of my life. Actually, it's not. It's not the Duress I'll be playing for the rest of my life because we also got to see some of the Japanese alternate art. And all of these look just absolutely breathtaking. Like, take a look at Duress's Japanese alternate art. That's nuts. Lightning Bolt looks good enough. The packs we'll be getting, but the Japanese pack get this Lightning Bolt right next to it, and that is just unbelievable. There's also Time Warp. Is Time Warp historic legal now, everybody? I'm confused. Is Time Warp historic legal? It looks really good, just the version that we're getting. That looks phenomenal. That's a slam dunk, but so does the Japanese version of it. That just, all of these look incredible to me. I mean, this couldn't be, in terms of decisions that Wizard has made recently, this couldn't be more of a slam dunk, in my opinion. Let me just go ahead and say that right off the rip here. This is just unbelievable to me that you're going to get one of these cards in every pack. And a lot of them are either commander playable cards or they're, you know, standard staples of some kind. You know, all the uncommons and whatnot are all from standard. So being able to have, you know, like really good looking versions of Cultivate and Shock and even like Strategic Planning, Duress, Snakeskin Veil, you know, that's just... that's great to me. And I think that these cards are probably, even though they're going to be fairly common because they appear in every pack, are still going to hold some value and be somewhat sought after. You know, putting a masterpiece in effectively every pack is incredible. And Time Spiral, and even Time Spiral Remastered, I think, is going to end up being one of the more beloved sets of all time. Time Spiral already is, and a lot of that has to do with time-shifted cards. These effectively are that, but you don't get to play the cards in Standard. You do get to play a lot of them in Historic, which I think creates hype for that format. There's nothing wrong with that. And, you know, being able to open these, some of these Commander staple cards in a Standard legal Magic pack, also really, really good. So I think that this is just... on like every possible tip. This is an unbelievably good decision by Wizards of the Coast, and I'm excited to open some of these packs just to get these beautiful cards. And I was already like somewhat excited for Strixhaven. Hey, I'm back, by the way. Ziggy's down here somewhere. I don't know if you can see him. There he is. There's his little head. Meow! Sorry, bud. But anyway, I was excited for Strixhaven already, but I had my worries. You know, I'm worried that this would be a Harry Potter set. I was worried that we'd see Harry Potter skins on cards, or like a Harry Potter Universes Beyond, some sort of congruent release or a secret lair, something like that. But we didn't get any of that, not yet at the very least. And one of my fears, and this is, there's reasons I guess I have this fear. There's reasons I'm paranoid in this way. But, you know, my fear is that Wizards is going to give us, you know, a beautiful card in every pack, Commander staples in one out of every few packs. You know, just this beautiful, brilliant idea to put effectively a card that's on par with the Masterpiece. Maybe not price-wise, but looks-wise. It's on par with the Masterpiece in every single pack. What an unbelievable decision I think is going to be universally loved by the player base. Well, they might be doing that to butter us up a little bit, right? For when they do drop the Harry Potter secret lair, or when they do say there's Harry Potter skins in this set or something. And a lot of us boo. This might be there as kind of a, hey, we gave you this, though. You know what I mean? I really hope that's not how it is. I really hope that's not how it is. Wizards has already said, you know, I believe a tweet, which I don't know if you can take that to the bank, but that this is, you know, their version of a wizarding school and nobody else's, which implies that Harry Potter and J.K. won't have anything to do with this. And I really hope that's the case. I really, really do. But one way or the other, if we're just talking about the addition of Mystical Archive, I think that it's a slam dunk. I think there's just nothing to not like about that. I'm really excited for it. It makes me way more excited for Strixhaven. And honestly, the cards they decided to show us today make me pretty excited about Strixhaven too. I can't wait to brew with some of these cards, you know. Overall, I will say that one way, it's kind of a hack way to review cards, honestly, but it's also one of the more common, popular, and in some ways useful ways of analyzing new cards. One of the most popular ways of doing that is to talk about what decks these cards slot into that are available to do so currently. And I don't see a whole lot of action for existing decks in this dump of cards. Now, some cards are powerful enough they will slot into existing decks. Don't get me wrong, but I just don't see a whole slew of cards that automatically slot into decks we already know exist. And my take on that is that it's a good thing. Now, it might mean that these cards have to wait on rotation to see some play or something like that. They might not. You know, Kaldheim affected the format, you know. So they might not have to wait. But if they do have to wait, I'm fine with that. I'm actually really looking forward to the format after rotation. I know a lot of you are. I'm not the only one. But I can't wait to brew with some of these cards on day one, just from what we've seen of the set so far, which is only like 10% of the set. That's all we've actually seen. But I'm still pretty excited about the stinking thing, because some of the cards we have seen, even though they don't slot into existing decks, doesn't mean they're bad. Not at all. And I get the same feeling when I was looking at Kaldheim spoilers, even this early. When I was looking at Kaldheim spoilers and I was thinking, oh, that card's neat. Oh, that card's neat. Can't wait to build a deck with that card. Can't wait to build a deck with that card. And I feel the same way the first day of Strixhaven spoilers. A lot of these cards are really unique, cool, do something awesome. I like the new mechanics. I like the idea of learn and lessons and best of one. I love Magecraft. Again, every creature is a young pyromancer. Like, yeah, please give that to me. Put it in my veins. So I like this set from what we've seen so far, and I'm excited to see more of it. Just let me know how you feel down there in the comments section. Like the video, subscribe to the channel for more spoilers, hit the bell for the notifications so you know when we put spoiler content out, and make sure you check me out on Twitch at twitch.tv/SBMTGDev, where this weekend we'll be doing a little bit more spoiler talk, and we can talk one-on-one about what we expect from what spoilers we've seen so far. I'm looking forward to that too. If you want to help support the channel, that would really mean a lot to me. Just go to patreon.com/SBMTG or hit the link in the description. $1 a month, and you can vote on what decks we do first in Strixhaven Standard. I think that's worth $1. So if you'd like to help me out, again, I'd greatly appreciate it. I need it. Hit the link in the description, go to Patreon, sign up, vote on what we do first next season. But aside from that, I guess I'm done. It's your turn. Again, go to the comment section. Let me know how you're excited about these, and let me know any stupid world-ending, standard-threatening combos that I may have missed, because I've done that in the past. Aside from that, I guess I'm done for now. Me and Ziggy are gotta get out of here and edit this video, because there's a lot to talk about in this one, Bubba. But anyway, I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.